It was a bright morning at the company headquarters, the kind of morning that usually passed without much excitement. Employees filled the building, walking quickly to their desks with coffee cups in hand, ready for another long day of meetings, reports, and endless emails. The conference hall on the top floor was already set up for a large gathering. Rows of chairs, polished tables, and a big screen glowing at the front created a serious but professional atmosphere. Most people came in expecting a regular meeting, nothing more. Nobody could have imagined that this ordinary day would take such an unusual turn as the employees settled into their seats. There was a quiet buzz in the air. Some chatted about their weekend, others whispered about the new project that was supposed to be discussed. A few looked at their watches impatiently, wishing the meeting would end quickly so they could get back to their own tasks. To them, it was just another corporate event that would probably be forgotten by the next day. Among those present was an engineer who had built a reputation for being clever, but also for having a sharp tongue. He believed he was smarter than most of the people in the room, and sometimes he showed it in ways that made others uncomfortable. While his skills were strong, his attitude often left a sour taste. Many of his colleagues kept their distance from him, not because they disliked his work, but because of how he carried himself full of pride, and always eager to show that he was right. He walked into the hall with a smug smile, glancing around as if the place belonged to him. He thought of the meeting as just another chance to show off his knowledge, to prove once again that he was the smartest person in the room. He didn't care much about who was leading the meeting or what the topic would be. To him, it was simply another stage, another spotlight to capture. At the front of the room, the preparations were almost complete. Technicians checked the microphones, adjusted the sound levels, and made sure the projector was working. The company had been waiting for this gathering for weeks because the CEO was expected to address the employees personally. For some, it was an exciting chance to hear directly from the top leader. For others, it was just a formality. The engineer leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table, impatiently waiting. He whispered something to the colleague beside him, smirking as if he already knew the meeting would be boring. His colleague gave a polite smile, but avoided eye contact. Not wanting to get involved in his arrogance, the room slowly quieted as the doors at the far end opened. A tall, confident figure walked in. It was the CEO himself, a man admired by many for his intelligence, calm nature, and strong leadership. Despite his achievements, he carried himself with humility, greeting people with a gentle nod and a kind smile. His presence filled the room in a way that demanded attention, without needing to raise his voice. The employees straightened in their seats. Some applauded lightly, while others prepared to take notes. The engineer, however, folded his arms across his chest and rolled his eyes slightly, as if unimpressed. In his mind, CEOs were just figureheads who took credit for the hard work of others. He didn't bother to hide his skepticism. The CEO stood at the podium and began to speak. His tone was calm yet powerful, and his words carried a sense of purpose. He spoke about the company's vision, the challenges they had overcome, and the exciting opportunities ahead. Most of the room listened with interest, nodding along as he painted a picture of growth and success. But the engineer sat with a smirk, convinced that he knew better. He believed the CEO's ideas were just empty words, corporate jargon that meant nothing in real life. As the speech went on, a strange tension began to build. While most people felt inspired, the engineer's dismissive body language stood out. Some employees noticed his attitude and shook their heads quietly, worried that he might say something foolish. The unusual feeling in the room wasn't just because of the CEO's presence. It was also because everyone could sense that something was about to happen. For the engineer, this was no longer an ordinary day. His impatience, arrogance, and lack of respect were slowly boiling beneath the surface. He thought this was just another dull meeting, but fate had something else planned. This day, which started so normally with coffee cups, casual conversations, and routine expectations, was about to take a dramatic turn. And it all began with the arrival of a CEO who was far stronger and wiser than the engineer had imagined. The ordinary meeting was no longer ordinary. A storm was quietly forming in that room, and the engineer had no idea that he was standing right at the center of it. Asterisk. The room was already filled with quiet conversations when the door opened once again. This time, the sound of footsteps changed the atmosphere completely. Every head turned toward the entrance. The CEO had arrived. He wasn't the kind of leader who needed a loud announcement or an entourage of assistants. He walked in with quiet confidence, his posture straight, his expression calm, and his eyes steady. He carried no arrogance, yet his presence alone commanded respect. He had built his reputation over years of hard work, rising through challenges and breaking barriers to become the leader of the company. His story was known to many in the room, a story of resilience, intelligence, and determination. For most employees, it was inspiring to see someone who had overcome so much stand at the top with dignity. The CEO greeted a few people along the way, nodding kindly and shaking hands with those who sat near the aisle. His smile was warm but professional, the kind of smile that made people feel acknowledged without losing authority. Several employees straightened their backs as he passed, wanting to appear attentive and respectful. But one person did not share the same sentiment. The engineer sat in his chair with an unimpressed look, almost as if he wanted to show that he was above this admiration. To him, the CEO was just another figure in a suit, someone who talked big but never really did the work. He believed that the real progress of the company came from people like him, the brains behind the projects, not from the executives at the top. The CEO reached the podium and took a moment to look around the room. He didn't rush into his speech. Instead, he allowed silence to settle, making sure every pair of eyes was on him. That pause, though short, carried power. People leaned forward, ready to listen. Even those who usually tuned out during meetings found themselves waiting for his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear. He began by acknowledging the efforts of the employees, thanking them for their contributions and dedication. His tone was neither overly dramatic nor distant. It was genuine. He spoke about the struggles the company had faced in the past year, about projects that had been tough but ultimately successful, and about the people who had worked behind the scenes to make it happen. Many employees felt a sense of pride as he mentioned these accomplishments. They nodded quietly, some even smiling, remembering the hard nights they had spent working. It wasn't just another corporate speech, it felt personal, as if he truly understood the effort that went into the company's growth. But while most of the room was engaged, the engineer crossed his arms and smirked. He thought the CEO was only repeating fancy words, dressing up ordinary achievements to look like miracles. In his mind, leaders like this were nothing but performers. He whispered under his breath, "Same old speech," and a few nearby colleagues gave him warning looks. Hoping he wouldn't draw attention to himself, the CEO continued, speaking about the company's future. He talked about innovation, inclusivity, and building a culture of respect and collaboration. His words carried a quiet strength, the kind of strength that comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it. People in the room listened closely, many of them taking notes, inspired by his vision. Still, the engineer wasn't moved. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if the speech was beneath him. The arrogance in his body language was impossible to miss. A few employees noticed and shifted uncomfortably, silently praying he would keep his thoughts to himself. The CEO, however, noticed everything. His sharp eyes caught the engineer's dismissive attitude, but he chose not to react immediately. Instead, he kept his composure, continuing his address with the same calm authority. That choice alone spoke volumes. A leader who could ignore disrespect in the moment and stay focused showed far more strength than one who responded impulsively. As the CEO spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. On one side were the employees who respected him deeply, hanging on his every word. On the other side sat the engineer, quietly challenging the very authority that stood before him. The contrast between humility and arrogance was clear, though no one yet knew how far it would go. By the time the CEO finished the opening part of his address, the stage was set. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer just a meeting yet, had become something larger, something charged with tension. The engineer's disdain had not gone unnoticed, and the CEO's calm patience was preparing to meet it. The entrance of the CEO had changed everything. What began as a normal gathering was now the beginning of a silent clash, one fueled by pride on one side and quiet strength on the other. The audience didn't realize it yet, but they were about to witness a moment that none of them would ever forget. The CEO had been speaking for nearly 20 minutes, carefully explaining the company's plans and the importance of teamwork. Most people listened quietly, jotting down notes or nodding at the right moments. The atmosphere was serious, but it carried a sense of motivation. Everyone seemed focused, everyone except the engineer. The engineer tapped his pen against the table, louder this time, as though he wanted people to notice his impatience. He leaned back in his chair and stretched, letting out a small sigh that drew a few annoyed glances from colleagues nearby. Still, no one said anything. People were used to his arrogance, and many had learned to ignore it. But then it happened, when the CEO introduced a new project idea, explaining how it could bring the company into a stronger market position. The engineer suddenly let out a short laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from humor. It was sharp, mocking, and filled with disrespect. The sound cut through the silence of the room, and all eyes turned toward him. The CEO paused mid-sentence, his gaze shifting to the source of the interruption. His calm expression didn't change, but the room had already shifted in mood. The employees exchanged nervous looks. Everyone knew this was not a place for such behavior, especially when the CEO himself was speaking. The engineer, however, seemed pleased with the attention. He raised his hand lazily, not out of respect, but as if he were granting himself permission to speak. With all due respect, he began, though his tone carried none. This plan sounds unrealistic. Honestly, it feels like we're chasing dreams instead of focusing on practical solutions. The words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. It wasn't unusual for employees to ask questions or even challenge ideas. But the way he said it, the smirk on his face, the condescending tone made it clear this was not a constructive comment. It was an insult disguised as feedback. Some employees lowered their eyes, wishing they could disappear. Others stared at the engineer in disbelief, silently wondering how he could be so bold or foolish. A few even shifted in their seats. Worried about what would happen next, the CEO took a slow breath and looked directly at the engineer. His calmness didn't waver. "I appreciate your input," he said evenly. "But I would like you to explain what part of the plan seems unrealistic to you." It was a fair response. A chance for the engineer to turn his insult into genuine discussion. But instead of softening, the engineer leaned forward with a grin. "Well, for starters," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you talk about innovation and inclusivity like they're magic buttons. But in reality, those words don't pay the bills. Maybe if we focused on actual engineering rather than these grand speeches, we'd be further ahead." A few gasps echoed through the room. The disrespect was no longer subtle. The undertones in his voice were sharp, almost personal. The engineer wasn't just questioning the plan, he was belittling the CEO's leadership, his vision, and even the values he stood for. The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared to move. The CEO stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the edges, his eyes still fixed on the engineer. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't frown, and he didn't rush to defend himself. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle. The engineer, mistaking this silence as weakness, pushed further. "I mean no offense," he continued, though every word contradicted that claim. "But sometimes leadership is too far removed from the reality of actual work. Maybe if you spent a day in the lab instead of the boardroom, you'd see how impossible these so-called ideas are." That was the spark. That was the moment when the ordinary meeting crossed a line. The employees shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the CEO and the engineer. Some clenched their fists under the table, wishing the engineer would stop before he destroyed himself. Others admired the CEO's composure, waiting to see how he would respond. But the engineer didn't stop. He was caught in his own pride, convinced that mocking the CEO in front of everyone would prove his intelligence. What he didn't realize was that he had just lit a fire he couldn't control. The CEO finally spoke again, his voice as calm as ever, but with a sharpness that made the room lean in. "I understand your perspective," he said, "but respect is as essential to progress as innovation itself. Without it, even the best work loses its value." The words were not shouted. They were not harsh. Yet they carried more weight than any loud rebuke could have. The engineer shifted slightly, but he kept the smirk on his face, unaware that his actions had already sealed his fate. The spark of disrespect had been lit. And though the flames were not yet visible, everyone in that room could sense the heat building. Something inevitable was coming, and the engineer was walking straight into it, blind to the consequences. The moment the engineer finished speaking, the room seemed to freeze. His words, sharp and mocking, hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker. For a few long seconds, no one moved. It was as if time itself had slowed down, allowing everyone to process what had just happened. The employees sat in stunned silence. Some stared wide-eyed at the engineer, as though they couldn't believe he had dared to speak that way. Others looked down at the table, pretending to review their notes, hoping to disappear into the background. A few exchanged quick glances, their eyes saying what their lips couldn't. "He's gone too far." One young assistant near the back fidgeted nervously with her pen, the rapid clicking echoing faintly through the quiet. She had never seen anyone speak to the CEO like that, not in private, let alone in front of the entire company. Her stomach churned with unease, as though she was witnessing a storm forming in slow motion. Near the front, an older employee leaned back in his chair and sighed, shaking his head. He had been with the company long enough to know that moments like this never ended well. Disrespect was one thing. Public humiliation of the CEO was another entirely. The engineer had crossed an invisible line, and everyone in the room knew it. The tension wasn't only about authority, it was about something deeper. The CEO wasn't just a figurehead. He represented resilience and progress. His very presence was proof that barriers could be broken, that leadership wasn't limited by background or skin color. To see him disrespected so openly didn't just feel rude, felt wrong. Many employees felt a quiet anger rising inside them, not for themselves, but for the man who had led them with dignity and fairness. Yet the CEO himself stood calm, almost too calm. His eyes remained steady, his face unreadable. That calmness unsettled the engineer's colleagues even more. They wondered what he was thinking, how he would respond, and whether this would be the moment when the engineer finally learned a lesson he had been avoiding his whole career. The engineer, however, seemed blind to all of this. He leaned back in his chair again, wearing a satisfied smirk as though he had just won an argument. In his mind, the silence meant victory. He believed he had exposed the CEO's words as nothing more than empty promises, and he enjoyed the attention, even if it came from shock and disbelief. But the silence in the room was not admiration. It was fear. It was discomfort. It was the quiet before something inevitable. A soft cough broke the stillness as one manager tried to shift the focus. He cleared his throat and whispered something about moving on, but his voice faltered. No one picked up the thread. The atmosphere was too heavy to ignore. On the other side of the room, two colleagues whispered to each other. "He's finished," one muttered under his breath. The other nodded grimly, replying, "He doesn't even realize it yet." The air grew warmer, thicker, almost suffocating. Every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the squeak of a chair, the hum of the projector felt louder than usual. The weight of the engineer's arrogance pressed down on everyone, and yet nobody dared to challenge him directly. They all waited, their attention fixed on the CEO, wondering when and how he would act. Some employees felt pity for the engineer. Yes, he was arrogant, but perhaps he didn't truly understand the gravity of his actions. Others felt no sympathy at all. They believed he deserved whatever was coming for him. After all, how could someone so intelligent be so blind? In that moment, the engineer wasn't just an individual anymore. He had become a symbol, the symbol of disrespect, pride, and ignorance. And the CEO, with his calm and steady presence, had become the opposite symbol: dignity, patience, and controlled strength. The clash between the two wasn't just about a disagreement over strategy. It was about values. It was about respect. The employees sat on the edge of their seats, silently choosing their sides without even realizing it. Most sided with the CEO, not because he was their boss, but because his quiet composure reflected something greater than power. It reflected true leadership. And still, the engineer sat comfortably, as if nothing had happened. He mistook the heavy silence for hesitation, when in truth it was anticipation. Everyone in that room knew change was coming. They just didn't know when the storm would break. The room had reacted, though no words were spoken. The collective silence, the uneasy glances, the stiff posture of nervous employees, all of it painted a picture clearer than any outburst could. The engineer stood alone in his arrogance, while the rest of the company waited. Breath held for the moment when justice would arrive. What no one realized was that the CEO's calmness wasn't weakness. It was preparation. He had chosen silence, not because he was unsure, but because he was calculating. The storm was not going to erupt in anger. It was going to arrive with precision, leaving no room for doubt about where the line between respect and arrogance truly stood. And in that conference room, filled with heavy air and watchful eyes, everyone knew the same truth. The engineer had lit a fire, and sooner or later, he would be burned by it. The silence could no longer stretch. The weight of the engineer's words still lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. Every employee sat tense, waiting for the CEO to respond. They knew something had to happen. The insult was too sharp, too public, too direct to pass without consequence. The air was heavy with anticipation. The CEO remained at the podium, his hands resting calmly, his gaze steady on the engineer. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply allowed the stillness to deepen, making the engineer squirm under the invisible pressure of 100 watching eyes. But the engineer didn't recognize it for what it was. He mistook the pause for hesitation, for weakness. He leaned forward again, as if to strike while the silence was still unbroken. "I'm only saying what everyone else is thinking," he said loudly, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Maybe it's time we admit that the company needs more realists and fewer dreamers at the top." That was it. The final straw. The room stiffened as though a cold wind had swept through it. Even the boldest employees lowered their eyes, unable to look at the CEO directly. They were waiting for it, the moment of reckoning. The CEO drew a slow breath, and when he finally spoke, his words cut sharper than any raised voice could have. "Respect," he said, His voice, calm but firm, is the foundation of every great company. Without it, even brilliance becomes destructive. The room grew stiller, if that was even possible. His words were measured, his tone unwavering, but there was an undeniable power behind them. The engineer shifted slightly in his chair, his smirk faltering for the first time. Yet, stubborn pride held him. He folded his arms, as if to shield himself from the weight of the CEO's presence. The CEO's eyes never left him. "You have talent," he continued, "but talent without humility destroys more than it creates. And disrespect, especially in this room, before your colleagues is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of weakness." The engineer swallowed hard. The smirk was gone now, replaced with a flicker of unease. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated the man standing before him. But it was already too late. The CEO glanced toward the senior executives sitting along the side of the room. They had been watching quietly, their expressions serious, their eyes sharp. A small nod from the CEO was all it took. One of the executives leaned forward, whispering to an HR director who sat nearby. The whisper spread like a current dot. Then, with deliberate precision, the HR director rose to her feet. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall. She walked forward, papers in her hand, her steps steady. The engineer watched her with growing confusion. His arrogance wavered. He shifted in his seat. Suddenly aware that this was no longer a simple exchange of words, the CEO spoke again, his voice unwavering. "This company values intelligence, but intelligence without respect has no place here. We will not allow arrogance to poison the culture we have built. Not today. Not ever." The HR director stopped beside the engineer's chair. Every eye in the room was on him now. His face reddened, a sheen of sweat forming at his temples. The confidence he carried when he mocked the CEO had vanished, replaced by the sinking realization that this was the end of the road. Effective immediately, the HR director said clearly, her voice echoing through the hushed room. "Your employment with this company is terminated." Gasps filled the air. The engineer's eyes widened in shock, as though he couldn't believe what he had heard. He looked around desperately, searching for support, but all he found were lowered eyes and tight jaws. No one would come to his defense. His colleagues had silently chosen their side. And it was not his. The CEO remained calm, his expression unreadable, but there was strength in his composure. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't humiliated the engineer with insults. He had simply let the truth of his actions condemn him. That was true power. The engineer tried to speak, stammering half-formed excuses, but his words failed. The silence of the room swallowed him whole. The HR director placed the papers in front of him, waiting for his signature. His hands shook as he reached for the pen, the weight of his downfall pressing hard against him. For the rest of the employees, the moment was unforgettable. They had just witnessed the cost of arrogance, the price of disrespect. And they had seen how real leadership handled conflict, not with rage, but with calm authority and unshakable principle. The engineer scribbled his name, his hand trembling, and stood slowly. His chair scraped back, the sound harsh in the stillness. He avoided the eyes of his colleagues as he gathered his things, his face pale with shame. What he had once mistaken for strength-macking, belittling, Defia had turned into the cause of his public collapse. The CEO said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room itself carried the weight of the lesson. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and it had spoken louder than any argument ever could. The engineer stood frozen for a moment, as if his mind couldn't fully accept what had just happened. Fired, not in private, not behind closed doors, but in front of the entire company. His face flushed red, his lips parted as if he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. The room had already passed judgment. Silence had become his loudest punishment. When he finally picked up his bag, the sound of the zipper felt louder than thunder. Every employee's eyes followed his movements, though most avoided direct contact. No one wanted to meet his gaze, because in that gaze was a storm of shame, anger, and disbelief. He tried to walk slowly, as if to keep some dignity, but the weight of humiliation pressed on his shoulders. Each step felt heavier than the last. The long walk from his chair to the exit was no more than 30 feet, but it felt like 1,000. Chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The silence carved itself deep into the walls of the conference room. Some employees pitied him. They knew he was talented, perhaps even brilliant in his field. But his pride had burned brighter than his ability, and now it had consumed him. Others felt no pity at all. They thought of the times he had mocked their ideas, dismissed their hard work, or boasted about his own superiority. For them, this was justice finally served at the front of the room. The CEO remained composed, his eyes following the engineer only briefly before turning back to the rest of the employees. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't smirked. He hadn't delivered any cruel words. Instead, his calmness seemed to remind everyone that leadership was not about ego, was about example. As the engineer reached the door, he hesitated. For a second, it looked like he might turn back, might try one last time to save face with a defiant remark. His hand hovered over the doorknob. But then he noticed the eyes still fixed on him, not supportive, not sympathetic, but firm. There was no room for defiance now. Only exit. He pulled the door open and slipped out, the soft click behind him sounding like the final note of a closing chapter. The room exhaled. It wasn't a loud sound, but a quiet release of tension, like the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Some people sat straighter. Others scribbled notes they had abandoned. But all of them carried the weight of what they had just witnessed. They hadn't simply seen a firing, they had seen a lesson. The fallout wasn't just about the engineer. It was about what his downfall meant for everyone else. A message had been delivered without the CEO ever needing to raise his voice. Disrespect would never be tolerated, no matter how skilled or intelligent the person might be. Arrogance had no place where teamwork, humility, and respect were the foundation. A manager whispered softly to the colleague beside him. "That's the end of him." The colleague nodded, but added, "And the beginning of something stronger for us." That quiet exchange summed up what many were feeling. The company had lost one employee. It had gained something more important, a renewed sense of unity. The CEO finally spoke again. His voice, calm but steady. "Let today be a reminder," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "Our success is not built on disrespect. It is built on collaboration, humility, and the belief that every person here has value. No one stands above respect." His words landed with weight, not because they were shouted, but because they were true. Employees nodded silently. Some even felt a renewed pride in being part of the company. They knew their leader wasn't just protecting his own dignity, he was protecting the culture that gave everyone a chance to grow. In the hall outside, whispers had already begun. News of the engineer's firing spread quickly through the building. Those who hadn't been in the room learned within minutes what had happened. Some were shocked. Others weren't surprised at all, remembering the engineer's arrogance in past meetings. But for everyone, the message was the same. The company would not bend to ego. Inside the conference room, the meeting continued, though it no longer felt like a meeting. It felt like a turning point. Employees leaned forward, listening to the CEO with a new kind of respect. Every word he spoke carried greater meaning now, not because of what he had said, but because of what he had done, or rather, how he had handled what was done to him. The public fallout wasn't loud. There were no cheers, no applause, no celebration. It was quieter, deeper. It was the kind of moment that lived in people's memories. That became a story told again and again in hushed tones. The day arrogance walked into a meeting and was shown the door, and while the engineer left with shame, the company remained with a stronger bond, united by a lesson none of them would ever forget. Asterisk, the door had closed behind the engineer, but his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. The conference hall was still heavy with silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of realization. Something meaningful had happened, something that would echo long after the chairs were emptied and the lights were switched off. The CEO stood calmly at the podium, his posture unshaken, his voice steady as he addressed the room once more. He didn't speak about the engineer, nor did he gloat about the decision. He spoke about respect. He spoke about dignity. He spoke about the values that had built the company from the ground up. His words weren't dramatic or decorated, but they were real. And that made them unforgettable. Employees listened differently now. Where earlier there had been quiet nods, now there was deep attention. His words sank into them like seeds into soil, planting lessons that would grow long after this day was over. They realized that leadership wasn't about power, and success wasn't about being the loudest or the smartest in the room. Leadership was about patience, humility, strength that did not need to shout. As the CEO continued, people began to feel a sense of pride, not just in their work, but in their company. They understood that they weren't just working for profits or projects. They were part of a culture where respect mattered more than arrogance, and where people were valued for who they were as much as for what they could do. Whispers spread after the meeting ended. Not the whispers of gossip, but of reflection. Employees discussed what they had seen, replaying the scene in their minds. Some admitted they had once been afraid to speak up when the engineer mocked them. Others confessed they had secretly hoped he would one day face consequences. Now that day had come, and it carried a message larger than punishment. It was about principle. The lesson left behind was simple, but powerful. No talent, no brilliance, no position could ever excuse disrespect. Respect was the invisible thread holding the company together. And once it was broken, everything else unraveled. Over the following weeks, the story traveled through every corridor, every coffee break, every late-night chat between colleagues. Were you there when it happened? Some would ask. Those who had witnessed it firsthand would nod slowly, their eyes carrying the memory. The story was told again and again, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Don't let arrogance blind you. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't believe talent alone can save you when respect is lost. The engineer's name eventually faded, but the lesson remained. New employees heard about it as a cautionary tale. Managers mentioned it quietly when discussing company values. It became more than just an event. It became a story of what happens when pride collides with dignity. And dignity wins. The CEO, meanwhile, carried on as he always had. He didn't change his style, didn't alter his calm and measured way of leading. But in the eyes of his employees, he had grown taller. He had shown them what leadership looked like in its purest form. A show of force, not a burst of anger, but a steady hand that guided with principle. For the employees who had witnessed it, the memory stayed like a mark in time. Years later, when they faced moments of arrogance or disrespect in their own careers, they remembered that day. They remembered the engineer's smirk, fading, the silence of the room, and the steady voice of the CEO who reminded them all that respect is not optionally, is essential. The story didn't end with the engineer leaving. It ended with the company moving forward, stronger than before. It ended with individuals carrying a lesson into their own lives, into their families, into their friendships. Treat others with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. That was the lesson left behind, written in a manual. Not printed in a policy, but etched into memory by a moment no one could forget.